It was the sort of day that made one glad to be English. The sky was brushed in gentle strokes of cloud, the sun warm but not brazen, and a slight breeze rustled through the privet hedges like a whisper shared by the village itself. At Cargate Hill, the sprawling Georgian home of Colonel and Mrs. Brackendale, bunting danced lazily across the lawn as the annual St. Mary Mead garden party came into full swing. Tables laden with Battenberg cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and gleaming teapots were arranged near the rose beds. The vicar's wife was deep in conversation with the postmistress about her new marmalade recipe, and a brass band of questionable harmony braved their third rendition of Rule Britannia. Children darted between hedges and parasols, their laughter ringing like bells. One could scarcely imagine anything unpleasant intruding upon such an afternoon. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably seated beneath a white parasol with her knitting in her lap and a cup of tea cooling beside her, was observing it all with her usual air of innocent curiosity. She had just finished the heel of a rather tricky sock, argyle, no less, and was keeping one eye on young Daphne Durrell, who was whispering quite urgently to Rupert Sims, the chemist's son. Miss Marple thought it rather early in the year for romance, but tucked away the observation all the same. The event was intended to be the highlight of the village's social calendar, and this year had an added poignancy. It was held in memory of Lady Agnes Gresham, who had passed away suddenly 3 weeks prior, and whose funeral had, by village standards, been quite the affair. Her family, never particularly warm toward the local population, had surprised everyone by not only attending the garden party, but sponsoring the rose competition. Lady Agnes's niece, the elegant but vaguely discontented Letitia Barton, was representing the family in a flowing blue frock and pearl earrings that Miss Marple suspected were not entirely Letitia's own. But then, halfway through the judging of the dahlias, an unmistakable commotion began near the west edge of the garden, just behind the yew hedge that separated the formal lawn from the shaded cemetery of St. Margaret's Church. There had been workmen at the church all week, repairing a leaning gravestone and restoring the Gresham family mausoleum. A shout pierced the afternoon air, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dropped, and then the silence of too many ears straining to listen at once. Within moments, the crowd had shifted toward the edge of the lawn, like water toward a drain. Colonel Brackendale, florid and sputtering, tried to restore order, but it was too late. 2 gravediggers emerged, pale and shaken, one holding something wrapped in an old cloth. It was Letitia who screamed first, pointing at the bundle as it was unwrapped and revealed to the garden party attendees, who were now half horrified, half fascinated. Inside the cloth lay a gold bracelet, ornate, antique, and unmistakably familiar to those who had seen it often adorning Lady Agnes's wrist. But she was buried with that bracelet. Letitia stammered, one hand to her mouth. I made sure of it myself. We all did. It was her favorite. A hush fell over the party as the meaning sank in. If the bracelet had been buried with Lady Agnes, yet had now turned up in the coffin of someone else, whose coffin had been disturbed by accident during repairs, what could that mean? Miss Marple, who had not yet risen from her seat, gently laid down her knitting. Her face was calm, but her eyes had narrowed ever so slightly. She looked over at Letitia, so pale, so suddenly unsure, and then toward the churchyard, where the workmen hovered uneasily, aware that something far more serious than a cracked gravestone had now been unearthed. The sun continued to shine. The band, unsure whether to resume, stood mute with their instruments. In the distance, the village bell began to chime 3 o'clock. And just like that, the ordinary peace of St. Mary Mead had been undone. The murmur of curiosity swelled like a rising tide, and then, just as suddenly, receded into a tense hush as Letitia Barton lowered her trembling hand. The bracelet lay on a folded tea-cloth now, resting atop a marble tomb slab like some peculiar relic from an age not quite past. A sharp glint of late afternoon sunlight caught the curve of its clasp, and the sparkle, usually pleasing in the drawing-room, seemed suddenly ghoulish in the churchyard's shadow. Colonel Bracondale stepped forward, puffing indignantly. "We'll have no more of this macabre gawping. This is a private family matter. Respect for the dead, if you please." But even as he spoke, Reverend Calthorpe approached, his face etched with a kind of polite bewilderment. I believe this should be addressed carefully, Colonel. The coffin in question, well, it isn't Lady Agnes's." Letitia blinked. "But I told you, she was buried in the family crypt." "Next to Uncle Theodore." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Yes, quite. And the crypt remains undisturbed. This coffin was unearthed by accident, down near the northern edge of the cemetery, behind the old yew. The ground subsided where the workmen were installing a new foundation, and a previously unmarked grave was disturbed." "Unmarked?" Letitia echoed, growing visibly pale. "But how? Who?" The Reverend cleared his throat. "We don't know yet. The coffin was old, but not ancient. Possibly 20 years, perhaps fewer. No marker above it. It was when the lid split open during the equipment movement that, well, the bracelet was noticed." Miss Marple stood then, not hurriedly, but with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that such moments were best observed with clarity rather than alarm. She moved toward the church path, her eyes not fixed on the bracelet or the whispering crowd, but on the people watching it. Faces told stories, and sometimes more than they meant to. Mrs. Penelope Dewhurst, the baker's widow, whispered fiercely to her daughter about omens and bad soil. Mr. Sims, the chemist, adjusted his glasses with mechanical precision, his eyes darting not at the bracelet, but toward Letitia. Daphne Durrell clutched her handbag as though someone might steal it. All small things, but meaningful, Miss Marple thought. Letitia suddenly turned to Reverend Calthorpe. "You said the coffin was unmarked. But surely someone must know who was buried there." Reverend Calthorpe hesitated. "We'll have to consult the burial records. Some of the older entries were never properly transcribed after the war. The grounds in that corner were occasionally used for emergency interments, war casualties, evacuees, even travelers who passed away unexpectedly. But I assure you, we shall investigate." Miss Marple's soft voice slipped into the air, almost unnoticed. "I seem to recall a certain Evelyn Hargreaves was buried near the north hedge, just before the end of 45. Pneumonia, if memory serves, but she was given a marker, a rather simple one with a carving of ivy. That wouldn't match the location, would it, Reverend?" The clergyman blinked at her. "Indeed, Miss Marple, you are correct. I had forgotten. No, this was several yards from Miss Hargreaves's grave, farther toward the old caretaker's shed. Practically under the roots of that gnarled yew." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "Curious, then, that such a spot would be used for a burial without formal record." Letitia, who had grown increasingly agitated, stepped forward. But the bracelet, how on earth did it end up in someone else's grave? I saw it on her wrist. I kissed her hand before the coffin was closed. It was there. "It may have been removed afterward," the colonel offered gravely, "perhaps by someone at the mortuary." "These things happen," Letitia recoiled. "Are you suggesting it was stolen and reburied?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained composed. "It would be a very elaborate sort of theft. One would imagine a simpler means of disposal would be available to a common thief. No, I rather think the bracelet meant something to whoever placed it in that coffin." There was a brief silence. Even the children had gone quiet, gathered near the lemonade table with solemn eyes. Miss Marple turned to Letitia gently. "Forgive me, my dear, but did Lady Agnes ever express concern about that bracelet? Was it of sentimental value, or perhaps entangled with a past event?" Letitia hesitated. "It belonged to her mother. An heirloom, yes. She always said it was cursed, though she meant it jokingly. Said it brought out the worst in people. Petty arguments, family rifts, even the occasional scandal. Scandal, Miss Marple prompted delicately. Letitia's lips parted, but then she faltered. Oh, nothing of importance. Just family stories. She always insisted it stay in the family, no matter what. At that, Miss Marple said nothing more. She looked again toward the grave, now hastily covered with tarpaulin as the constable arrived. There was much yet to be known, but something had lodged in her mind, a small splinter of wrongness. Not forensic, certainly not criminal in the way the papers like to print, but wrong in that subtle human way. Like a smile given at the wrong moment, or a lie told without knowing precisely why it was needed. The party ended in subdued fragments. No one lingered over sponge cake now, and the band quietly packed away their instruments. Letitia was escorted back to the Brackendale residence by Colonel and Mrs. Brackendale, though not without protest. Miss Marple watched her go, noting the stiffness in her shoulders, the guarded tone with which she addressed even the Colonel, once a trusted godparent. The bracelet had been taken into police custody, though no one knew quite what to label it. Not a weapon, not stolen. And yet it had the peculiar, undeniable air of evidence. Evidence not of the crime itself, but of something tangled and long hidden, like a root that had grown around a bone. By evening, the village was alight with whispers. The Dewhurst girl said she saw a ghostly figure near the church the night before. Mr. Sims remarked that the bracelet might have been a duplicate, and Daphne Durrell boldly declared that Lady Agnes had always been a bit peculiar. Miss Marple sat in her garden that night, knitting forgotten in her lap, the soft hum of insects circling her porch lamp. She sipped a small glass of Madeira, her mind drifting not to ghosts or superstitions, but to motive. For she had learned, in her many years and many inquiries, that the most useful question was not how something had happened, but why. Why place a recognizable heirloom in a forgotten grave? Why now? Why here? And what else, she wondered quietly, had been buried, along with the truth? The next morning dawned with a pale light that seemed hesitant to dispel the lingering shadows of the previous day's revelations. St. Mary Mead awoke under a sky smeared with mist, as if the village itself were reluctant to face the unfolding mystery. Miss Marple, however, was already stirring, her routine undisturbed by the turmoil now gripping her usually tranquil home. She settled by the kitchen window with her usual pot of tea and a small plate of scones, contemplating the bracelet that had cast such a long shadow over the garden party. The delicate gold links, the tiny emerald clasp, a piece so distinctive it could not easily be mistaken or replaced. Yet, how it had come to rest in an unmarked grave beside the old yew was a question that nagged at her with persistent urgency. The post arrived punctually, and with it came a letter from Inspector Craddock, a professional associate of Miss Marple's, whose sharp mind often complimented her subtle observations. The letter was brief but informative. The police had opened an inquiry into the unmarked grave and the bracelet. The burial records were incomplete, and forensic examination was underway on the coffin and its contents. There was no sign of a body, however, a discovery that raised more questions than answers. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Absence of a body in a coffin was uncommon, but not unheard of. Sometimes vaults were reused, or bodies relocated without proper documentation, but such practices were frowned upon and tightly controlled. The fact that this had happened under the gaze of a small village with a deeply rooted respect for tradition was unsettling. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, a tall man with kind eyes and a demeanor that suggested he preferred calm to conflict. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said softly. "I thought I might find you here. There's something you ought to see, something that's come to light overnight." Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple invited him in. Dr. Haydock removed a small envelope from his coat pocket and laid it on the table. Inside was a photograph, aged and creased, showing a young woman with a haunting expression. The inscription on the back read simply, Evelyn Hargreaves, 1945. Evelyn Hargreaves, Miss Marple murmured, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. The woman Reverend Calthorpe mentioned yesterday. She was said to be buried near the northern hedge. Yes, said Dr. Haydock, but this photograph surfaced in the archives of the local historical society, alongside other documents related to the cemetery's upkeep. There's more. Records suggest Evelyn was the daughter of a wealthy family, but she died under circumstances that were never fully explained. Illness, officially, but there were whispers of something darker. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind. And yet her grave is well marked, which contrasts starkly with the unmarked coffin that yielded the bracelet. Dr. Haydock sighed. Exactly. And here's the odd part. Some of the older villagers recall seeing Evelyn shortly before she died, wearing a bracelet much like the one found yesterday. It was said to be a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Curious, Miss Marple said, especially since Lady Agnes's bracelet is said to be the same. Which leads to a troubling possibility, the doctor continued, that the bracelet found in the unmarked grave might not have belonged to Lady Agnes at all, but to Evelyn. That somehow the identities have been confused or deliberately obscured. Miss Marple's fingers twitched at the knitting in her lap. Then we must look closer at the Gresham family history and at the secrets buried, both literally and figuratively, in this village. Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village archive, a modest room nestled above the library where dusty ledgers and faded newspapers whispered of long-forgotten days. The archivist, Miss Nettie Collins, greeted her with a welcoming smile and immediately fetched the burial records, including a map of the cemetery as it stood in the 1940s. Together, they traced the position of Evelyn Hargreaves' grave, confirmed by a small sketch in the margin, a tiny ivy leaf carved into the stone. It was where Reverend Calthorpe had said, quite separate from the unmarked grave disturbed by the repair work. No record indicated the existence of a second burial nearby. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the ledgers carefully. Is there any mention of reburials or disturbances? Miss Collins shook her head. Only a few entries mentioning war-related burials in other parts of the cemetery, but nothing near the north hedge besides Evelyn. That afternoon, as she walked home through the village, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the steady click of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Rupert Sims, the chemist's son, approaching with a hesitant smile. Miss Marple, he began awkwardly, I wondered if you might spare a moment. There's something I overheard last night at the Green Dragon. I thought it best to mention it to you. Miss Marple inclined her head. Please, Rupert. What have you heard? He glanced around, lowering his voice. It concerns the bracelet. I heard two of the workmen talking about it after they left the site. They mentioned finding a letter inside the coffin, hidden beneath the bracelet. A letter? Miss Marple echoed, intrigued. Yes. They said it was sealed and looked very old, but no one told the police about it yet. Maybe because they thought it wasn't important, or maybe they didn't want to get involved. Did they say what was in the letter? She pressed. Rupert shook his head. No, only that it was addressed to someone named L.B. and dated 1944. Miss Marple's mind raced. The initials matched Lady Agnes's niece, Letitia Barton. The date, right in the middle of the war. And the secrecy surrounding it suggested a connection far deeper than mere family sentiment. Thank you, Rupert. You have done well to come to me. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the letter's existence weighing heavily in her mind. Who had placed it in that coffin? What secrets did it hold, and why had someone gone to such length to hide it? The questions swirled in her thoughts as the flames flickered. casting shadows on the walls like silent witnesses. There was more to this mystery than a misplaced bracelet or an unmarked grave. There were stories of love and betrayal, loyalty and deceit, folded into the fabric of the village's history, waiting patiently for the right moment to unravel. And Miss Marple, with her keen eye for the human heart, was ready to listen. The following morning was tinged with a subtle chill as Miss Marple made her way toward the Green Dragon, the village pub that, like an old hearth, drew the townsfolk into its warm embrace. She had learned from Rupert that the workman had spoken of a letter found beneath the bracelet, and the thought of such a secret, hidden so carefully, sent a ripple of anticipation through her quiet mind. Upon entering, she was greeted by the familiar murmur of low conversation, the clink of glasses, and the scent of worn oak and spilled ale. Seated in a corner by the window was Tom Blake, one of the workmen who had been at the cemetery the day the coffin was unearthed. His rough hands clasped a mug of ale, and when he noticed Miss Marple, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said gently, easing into the seat opposite him. "I understand you found something rather unusual in the coffin yesterday." Tom nodded, swallowing a mouthful of ale before replying. "Aye, ma'am. Not just the bracelet, but a letter as well. We thought it might be nothing, but it looked old, and when we saw the initials, well, it got us wondering." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet encouragement. "May I see the letter?" The man hesitated. "We didn't keep it, miss. Thought it best to hand it over to the police, but as of now, it's still with the inspector, or so I've heard." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did the letter's seal remain unbroken?" Tom frowned. "No, ma'am. One of us opened it, curious as we were. Said the handwriting was faint but clear. Did you catch any of its contents?" Tom's gaze dropped to the table, fingers drumming nervously. "Only that it was addressed to L.B. and spoke of secrets that must never be told." "That's about all. Secrets that must never be told," Miss Marple repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The phrase echoed in her mind, linking the hidden letter to the obscured histories of the Gresham family and the tangled web of village whispers. As she left the pub, Miss Marple's thoughts spiraled. Who had written that letter? Who was the secret keeper, and who was the intended recipient, and what were the secrets so dangerous they demanded silence beyond death itself? The day passed with a slow, deliberate pace. Miss Marple took a stroll through the village, stopping at the Gresham estate, a stately home that had witnessed generations of whispered scandals and proud legacies. The housekeeper, Mrs. Piper, answered her polite knock and led her into the drawing room, where sunlight filtered through heavy drapes and settled on worn leather chairs. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," Mrs. Piper said with a faint smile. "How can I assist you today?" "I hope you can help me, Mrs. Piper. I'm trying to piece together the story of Lady Agnes's bracelet and the mystery surrounding the letter found beneath it." Mrs. Piper's face paled slightly. "The bracelet? That old thing has caused no end of trouble. And the letter? I haven't heard a thing beyond what's been said in the village." "Did Lady Agnes ever mention a niece named Letitia Barton?" Miss Marple inquired carefully. Mrs. Piper nodded. "Yes, Miss Letitia was a bright girl, but rather headstrong. She left the village years ago and hasn't been seen since." "Do you know why?" The housekeeper hesitated. There were disagreements. Family matters best left unspoken. Letitia was involved in some scandal, I believe, though the details were never shared with us servants. The undercurrent of secrecy only deepened the mystery. Letitia Barton, the bearer of the initials L.B., the letter's recipient, had vanished without explanation. What could the letter reveal about her fate or her connection to Lady Agnes and Evelyn Hargreaves? As twilight approached, Miss Marple found herself back in the village square, where whispers fluttered like restless leaves. She overheard fragments of conversation between villagers, speculation and rumor blending in the cooling air. "Did you hear? The police say there's no body in the coffin. How can that be? Whose bracelet was it then? Some say it belonged to Evelyn Hargreaves. She died young, but they say she was troubled. Maybe the bracelet was hers all along. But what about Lady Agnes? She was seen wearing that bracelet just last month at the church fete." The contradictions layered the story with suspicion and doubt, but Miss Marple remained composed, trusting her instincts to untangle the truth from tangled lies. The next morning brought a visitor to her cottage, Inspector Craddock. His brow was furrowed and his tone carried the weight of fresh developments. "Miss Marple, I've examined the letter. It's a confession of sorts, though written in code and riddles. It speaks of a sin carried in silence and a debt of blood, owed to the past." Miss Marple nodded. "And the writer?" "The handwriting matches that of Letitia Barton. She wrote it in 1944, the year before her disappearance. We're piecing together what might have happened." The inspector's news deepened the enigma. Letitia's letter, hidden for decades, seemed to hold the key to the bracelet's journey in the village's buried past. "Miss Marple," Craddock said quietly, "it appears this mystery is far from over. The bracelet, the letter, the unmarked grave, they're all threads of a story that's been woven in secrecy for too long." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her mind already weaving the next layer of the tapestry. "Then we must look closer at those who remain, those whose lives touched the past, and whose silence might still conceal the truth." Together, they agreed to meet with the remaining family members of the Greshams and the Barton line, knowing that only through patient observation and gentle inquiry could the shadows begin to recede. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, the village settled once more into its quiet rhythms, unaware of the secrets lingering in the twilight, waiting for Miss Marple to uncover them. The early morning mist clung stubbornly to the hedgerows as Miss Marple walked slowly down the lane toward the Barton estate, her thoughts circling the puzzle that had gripped the village. The letter from Letitia Barton, the mysterious niece who had vanished so many years ago, remained a fragile thread connecting past and present, and it was clear that only by facing the living could the truth be uncovered. The Barton house, a modest but dignified residence, stood surrounded by gardens that once must have flourished under a more generous hand. The paint on the window frames was peeling, and the gravel driveway bore the scars of years of neglect. Yet, as the door creaked open, the air inside was surprisingly warm, filled with the scent of lavender and old paper. Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Edith Barton, the current head of the family and Letitia's elder sister. Mrs. Barton was a woman whose pale features and carefully arranged grey hair hinted at a life devoted to duty and restraint. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of unease as she ushered Miss Marple into the sitting room. "I've heard of your visit, Miss Marple," Edith said, her voice steady but formal. "You wish to know about Letitia. It has been many years since she left, and yet the past seems to cling as stubbornly as the ivy on these walls." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I believe, Mrs. Barton, that the past often whispers truths we would rather ignore. I'm hoping you might help me understand what Letitia's disappearance meant to this family, and to the village." Edith sighed, settling into her chair. Letitia was always a spirited soul, full of dreams that did not conform to our expectations. She loved to write, often scribbling letters and poems that seemed to speak of secrets and sorrows. Her departure was sudden and shrouded in silence. Father was a strict man, and when she left, he never spoke of her again. "Did Letitia have close friends here?" Miss Marple inquired. "Few. She was considered peculiar by many, and some whispered she was a troublemaker," Edith admitted, "but there was one person she trusted, James Hargreaves." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. James Hargreaves was a name she had encountered before, the son of the late Evelyn Hargreaves, whose coffin had yielded the mysterious bracelet. "James Hargreaves," she murmured, "and what became of him?" "James was kind to Letitia," Edith said. "They shared a connection that puzzled us all, though what it was exactly, no one truly knew." After Letitia left, James seemed to withdraw from the village. He moved away and rarely returned. The threads of the story began to knot tighter. The bracelet, the letter, the unspoken connection between Letitia and James. There was more beneath the surface than met the eye. Miss Marple, ever patient, pressed on. Did Letitia's letters ever mention James directly? Edith hesitated. Not by name. But she spoke of a friend who knew the truth and a debt owed to the past. I have some of her letters, though many were lost or destroyed by father before his death. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. May I see what remains? From a worn, leather-bound box, Edith produced a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, but the words held a weight of sorrow and warning. One letter, in particular, caught Miss Marple's attention. It spoke of a secret shared between Letitia and James, a past mistake that could destroy more than reputations if revealed. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the home of James Hargreaves, now a middle-aged man living quietly on the outskirts of the village. His modest cottage bore the marks of a solitary life. Books piled high on shelves, photographs of a younger, happier time, and a worn armchair by the fire. James greeted her with cautious hospitality, his eyes wary but polite. When Miss Marple mentioned Letitia, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Regret, perhaps, or grief. "Letitia was the brightest light in my youth," James admitted quietly. "We shared dreams and secrets, but the world was not kind to us. Her departure broke something inside me, something I never healed." "Do you recall the nature of the secret she wrote about?" Miss Marple asked softly. James sighed, folding his hands in his lap. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness that set off a chain of consequences. It involved Lady Agnes Gresham and a matter of inheritance, something that would have shattered our families. Miss Marple leaned in, sensing the gravity behind his words. "Do you believe this secret is connected to the bracelet and the letter found in the coffin?" "I do," James said firmly. "That bracelet was a symbol of a promise made in youth, a promise that was never kept. The letter was Letitia's way of confessing and warning. The pieces began to fall into place with a quiet inevitability. The bracelet, once Lady Agnes's, had passed to Letitia in trust, symbolizing a bond that neither family wished to acknowledge openly. The hidden letter, the confession, the disappearance. It all spoke of a hidden pact and the heavy burden of silence. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the village, Miss Marple thanked James and walked back along the lane, the weight of the secrets pressing gently on her mind. The surface calm of St. Mary Mead concealed undercurrents of sorrow, betrayal, and regret, but she felt certain that with patience and careful observation, the truth would soon reveal itself. Later that evening, back in her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple reviewed the letters once more. A subtle detail caught her eye, an obscure reference to a place called The Hollow, a location none had yet mentioned. The hint was slight, almost a throwaway line in one of Letitia's letters, but to Miss Marple, it was a beckoning signpost. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would visit The Hollow. The journey to uncover the bracelet's story was far from over, and the village's buried past awaited her gentle, relentless scrutiny. The morning air was crisp and still, the early sun casting a gentle glow over the rolling fields beyond St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple set out at a leisurely pace toward the location hinted at in Letitia's letter. The Hollow. It was a name she had heard in passing but never given much thought to. Now, it promised to be a key to unlocking yet more of the tangled past. The hollow lay a mile or so beyond the village, a secluded depression in the landscape bordered by dense hedgerows and ancient oaks. It was a place that had long ceased to be of any practical use. Once farmland, now it was little more than a forgotten green pit, whispered about by children and avoided by the village folk, some of whom muttered superstitions about its murky past. As Miss Marple walked the narrow path toward the hollow, she reviewed what she knew. The bracelet had belonged to Lady Agnes Gresham, a woman whose influence had lingered like a shadow in the village long after her death. The bracelet's appearance in Evelyn Hargreaves' coffin had been a shock, but now it was clear that it was more than a mere trinket. It was a symbol of something deeper, a secret shared by the Barton and Hargreaves families, and perhaps others. Arriving at the edge of the hollow, Miss Marple paused, peering into the sunken area. The ground was soft, the grass thick with dew, and the air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth. It seemed an unlikely place for a secret to be buried or uncovered. As she made her way down into the hollow, the crunch of gravel startled her. Turning, she saw a figure emerge from behind a tree. It was Dr. Peter Clarkson, the village physician, whose steady presence had been a quiet constant in recent days. His expression was guarded, almost hesitant. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding a greeting. "I thought I might find you here." "Dr. Clarkson," she replied. "I was just considering this spot. It seems to hold more than just old earth and grass." Peter sighed, stepping forward. "There's something about the hollow that has always unsettled the villagers. Not just superstition, but history. I've heard whispers that it was once the site of a family dispute, long ago, involving the Bartons and Greshams. Some say a tragedy occurred here, though no official records remain." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And you say no records? But surely the local archives or parish records might hold a clue." Peter nodded. "I have access to them at the surgery. I was meaning to look into it, but got caught up with other duties." "Well, perhaps a visit to the archives together would be productive," Miss Marple suggested with a small smile. "It's clear the past refuses to stay buried." They agreed to meet later that morning at the parish archives, a small, orderly room at the back of the village church, where dusty ledgers and brittle documents were stored. The archivist, a stooped gentleman named Mr. Pritchard, was accustomed to their visits and greeted them with a knowing smile. Hours passed as Miss Marple and Peter sifted through birth and death registers, property deeds, and letters filed under family names. It was tedious work, but occasionally a name or date caught their attention. The key discovery came when Miss Marple unfolded a yellowed letter from a solicitor dated some 50 years prior. It spoke of a dispute over inheritance rights following the death of Sir Reginald Barton. The letter outlined claims made by Lady Agnes Gresham, asserting a stake in the Barton estate through a secret marriage her husband had kept hidden. The solicitor's cautious language suggested suspicion and warned of potential scandal should the matter be publicized. "Here, Peter," Miss Marple said, pointing to a passage. "This explains the bracelet." It was likely a token of the secret marriage given by Sir Reginald to Lady Agnes. The bracelet's presence in Evelyn Hargreaves' coffin hints that the secret was passed down through her family. Peter frowned. That also means Letitia Barton's letter was a confession tied to this dispute. If she knew of the secret marriage, it might explain why she disappeared, perhaps to protect the family's reputation. But why the bracelet in Evelyn's coffin? Peter asked, perplexed. It suggests someone wanted that secret to be remembered or revealed after her death. Miss Marple tapped the letter thoughtfully. Or to ensure that someone would investigate further. A posthumous message, if you will. As they continued their research, another name emerged, Henry Gresham, Lady Agnes's son and Evelyn's brother. Records indicated he had fallen out with his family shortly before Evelyn's death. Rumors suggested he had been desperate to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Miss Marple and Peter exchanged a glance. "Henry may be worth speaking to," Miss Marple said quietly. His actions might provide the missing link. Leaving the archives, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the chase, the way pieces of a puzzle, once scattered, gradually came together under patient scrutiny. Yet she also sensed shadows lurking just beyond the edges of the facts. Back in the village, news of their discoveries spread quietly, carried in whispers from one doorstep to another. The atmosphere grew charged with unease. Neighbors glanced sideways, and old wounds seemed to reopen in hushed conversations. That evening, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she was met unexpectedly by Henry Gresham himself. The man was gaunt and sharp-eyed, his presence both commanding and unsettling. He greeted her with a measured politeness, but his gaze was penetrating. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hear you've been digging into the past, my family's past. Some things are best left undisturbed." "I am only seeking truth, Mr. Gresham," she replied calmly. "The past, after all, shapes the present." Henry's smile was thin. "Be cautious, then. Some secrets are guarded not only by silence, but by those who would see them remain so." With that cryptic warning, he turned and walked away, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his words under the growing moonlight. Inside, as she sat by the fire, the puzzle pieces settled for a moment. The bracelet, the letter, the hollow, and the fractures within two families bound by secrets. The next steps would require delicate tact and keen observation. And as always, Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, calm of St. Mary Mead, the currents of human nature were never still. The morning after her meeting with Henry Gresham, Miss Marple awoke with a quiet sense of purpose. The man's veiled warning had not unsettled her, quite the contrary. It was precisely the kind of reaction she had expected from someone who had much to hide. There was no doubt in her mind that Henry was more than a mere shadow from the past. He was a living piece of the puzzle, and perhaps a guardian of those long-buried secrets. After her customary breakfast of tea and toast, she decided to take a stroll through the village, a practice she found invaluable. The rhythms of daily life often revealed nuances and tensions invisible to outsiders. Passing by the post office, she paused to chat with Mrs. Clement, who was tidying the flower beds outside the shop. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement greeted warmly. "Have you heard the latest? Seems the Greshams are all in a flutter since you started poking around." "I imagine old secrets have a way of disturbing the waters," Miss Marple replied, folding her hands. "And when the water stirs, what lurks beneath often comes to light." Mrs. Clement nodded knowingly but said no more. The village, it seemed, was bracing itself for revelations yet to come. Miss Marple's next visit was to the Barton estate, a grand but somewhat faded manor on the outskirts of the village. She had resolved to speak with Letitia Barton's husband, Charles. Though he was a reserved man, there was a steadiness to his demeanor that promised useful insight. Charles was alone in the drawing room, surrounded by the heavy silence of a house steeped in history. "Miss Marple," he greeted, standing to shake her hand. "I understand you have been looking into Letitia's disappearance and the bracelet." "Indeed, Charles," she said gently. "There are many threads here, and I believe they all lead back to your family." And the Greshams, Charles's face, darkened momentarily. Letitia was a complex woman, full of secrets. I cannot say I truly knew her, not in the way a husband should. She was burdened, perhaps more than I realized. Miss Marple inclined her head. Burdened by the past, or by people in the present? "That I cannot say," he murmured. "But her letters, the ones you have read, hinted at fear. Fear of something coming to light. Did she ever mention Henry Gresham?" Charles paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes, but only in passing." There was tension between them, old grievances rekindled in recent years. Henry believed Letitia had wronged him, perhaps in ways that involved the family legacy. Miss Marple allowed the silence to deepen before continuing. "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Visitors, Letters, or perhaps changes in Letitia's behavior. Charles looked away, troubled. A fortnight ago, she received a visitor late in the evening. A man I did not recognize, but who left quickly after a brief conversation. She was unsettled afterward. Did she say who he was? No, and I did not press her. Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire discreetly about this visitor. Every detail, no matter how small, might be a vital clue. Leaving the Barton estate, she felt the familiar stirrings of the mystery taking shape. The bracelet was no longer just an heirloom. It was a key to a long-standing feud, intertwined with fear, betrayal, and perhaps revenge. Her next call was to the Hargreaves' residence, where Evelyn's sister, Margaret, lived. Margaret greeted her with cautious warmth, her eyes shadowed by recent grief. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I heard you've been looking into Evelyn's death and the bracelet found with her." "Yes, Margaret," Miss Marple replied kindly. "It seems that bracelet is connected to secrets far older than any of us imagined." Margaret sighed. Evelyn was protective of family secrets, especially those involving the Greshams. She feared that reopening old wounds might tear the village apart. Do you know if she ever confided in anyone about these fears? Only to me, very late one evening. She spoke of a threat, a warning she had received but never revealed. Miss Marple's interest deepened. A threat from whom? Margaret shook her head. She never said. But she became increasingly anxious in the weeks before she died. Before she left, Miss Marple noticed a small photograph on the mantel, a faded image of Evelyn and Henry Gresham standing side by side, their expressions serious and guarded. The connection between the families was undeniable. That afternoon, as the village settled into the quiet lull before dusk, a new and unexpected development stirred the still waters. The local constable, Mr. Hargreaves, arrived at Miss Marple's door with an air of urgency. "Miss Marple," he began, "there's been an incident at the village hall." Charles Barton was found unconscious after a fall down the stairs. "The doctors say it's suspicious." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Suspicious? You mean someone might have harmed him?" "It appears so. A struggle was reported, and there are signs of forced entry. We are treating it as an attempted assault." Without hesitation, Miss Marple grabbed her shawl. "I must see him at once." At the hospital, Charles lay in a quiet room, bandaged and pale, but conscious. His eyes brightened when Miss Marple entered. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. "I fear this is connected to Letitia's secrets. Someone wants to stop the past from being uncovered." Miss Marple took his hand gently. "Charles, do you have any idea who might want to harm you?" He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I believe Henry Gresham is desperate. He has been threatening me since you started asking questions. He wants to protect the family name no matter the cost." Miss Marple's mind raced. The situation had escalated beyond whispers and warnings. Now it was a dangerous game, played in shadows and violence. As she left the hospital, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing closer. The bracelet had unearthed more than secrets. It had exposed old grudges that had festered into peril. And she knew the path ahead would require every ounce of her insight and patience. Back at her cottage, as twilight deepened, she sat by the window. The quiet village stretched out before her. The pieces were moving, and the story was far from over. The true depths of betrayal and fear remained hidden, waiting for the moment when light would finally reveal the truth. The morning following Charles Barton's mysterious fall brought with it a thick fog that wrapped the village in a muted silence. Miss Marple, rising early as usual, found her thoughts turning over the recent developments like stones in her hand, smooth and cold. The attempted assault on Charles was no accident. It was a desperate message, a warning meant to deter inquiry. Yet it had only deepened her resolve. Her first step was a quiet visit to Henry Gresham's home. The man's behavior, evasive during their brief encounter, had marked him as a man cornered by his own fears. She needed to observe him in his own element, to read the subtle tells of a man under pressure. The Gresham estate was an imposing structure, its brick facade weathered by years, but still dignified. The garden, usually well tended, showed signs of neglect, overgrown ivy, climbing the walls, and a scattering of fallen leaves that the servants had not cleared. As Miss Marple approached, the door was answered by a young maid, her eyes wide with cautious curiosity. "Is Mr. Gresham at home?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He is, madam," the maid replied, "but he's not well. He's been keeping to his study mostly." Miss Marple was ushered in, her footsteps echoing in the grand but sombre hallway. Henry appeared, seated by a window, pale and drawn. His eyes flicked toward her with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a thin smile. "I hear there's quite the stir in the village." "Yes, Henry," she said kindly. "It seems these matters concern you deeply." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They do. But some things are better left buried. The past has a way of poisoning the present if dredged up too recklessly." "I understand the past can be a burden," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes, revealing the truth is the only way to bring peace." Henry's gaze dropped to the floor. "You speak as if you know something of burden." "I only hope you do not push too hard. It could bring harm, not just to me, but to others." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a quiet understanding. "I only seek what is just, and justice is never without consequence." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. A young man entered briskly, his face set with determination. "Henry, we must speak. The villagers are talking and they are becoming restless." Henry's expression hardened. "Not now, Thomas." The younger man, Thomas Gresham, fixed Miss Marple with a glance before leaving without another word. Miss Marple caught the flicker of conflict between father and son, a fracture beneath the surface. Leaving the Gresham estate, Miss Marple pondered the dynamics she had witnessed. The Greshams were a family divided, shadows of old resentments playing out in quiet but profound ways. She resolved to learn more about Thomas, suspecting his role might be crucial. Her next visit was to the village pub, the Swan, a hub of gossip and local colour. Here she found Margaret Hargreaves, seated with a group of ladies, her expression guarded but attentive. As Miss Marple approached, Margaret excused herself and joined her by the fireplace. "I hear Charles Barton's condition is stable," Miss Marple began gently. "Yes, thank goodness," Margaret replied, "but the tension in the village is palpable. People whisper about old grudges resurfacing and wonder who might be behind all this." Miss Marple nodded. "And what do you think?" Margaret hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I fear this is about more than just family feuds. Evelyn's death, Charles's attack, the bracelet, they are threads of a tapestry woven long ago, involving betrayals that some would kill to keep hidden." "Have you noticed anything unusual yourself?" Miss Marple asked. Margaret glanced around the room. "There's been a stranger in the village these past days. I don't know his name, but he's been asking questions, too pointedly for comfort. I saw him near the Barton estate just before Charles was attacked." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did you speak with him?" "No, he keeps to himself, and the villagers are wary. The stranger's presence was a complication, an unknown variable in an already tangled mystery." Miss Marple made a mental note to inquire further. Later that afternoon, as the fog lifted and the sun edged through the clouds, Miss Marple walked the lanes toward the Barton estate once more. There was an air of cautious anticipation in the village. People passed her with hushed voices, eyes darting nervously. At the estate, she found Charles alone in the garden, sitting beneath a spreading oak tree. His injuries had left him fragile, but his eyes held a new determination. "Miss Marple, he said, rising slowly to greet her. "I want to speak frankly. The bracelet, it's more than a family heirloom. It's a symbol of a secret pact made generations ago. A pact that, if broken, carries dire consequences." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you believe this pact is the root of the danger you and your family now face?" "I do. Letitia discovered something worth killing for. She tried to protect us by hiding the bracelet, but it seems the past has caught up with her." Miss Marple studied his face, noting the weariness beneath his resolve. "Do you know who stands to benefit from silence?" Charles shook his head. "Only that those who would see the truth buried have grown desperate." As twilight approached, Miss Marple made her way home, her thoughts weaving the strands of this tangled web. The bracelet was no longer merely an object, but a symbol of power and fear, of secrets so dangerous they had led to murder and attempted assault. Back in her sitting room, she sat by the fire, a small notebook open on her lap. She began to write, organizing her thoughts, noting every name, every whispered fear, every small detail uncovered in the past days. The village's quiet exterior masked a storm of emotions and secrets, and Miss Marple knew that to unravel the truth, she would have to be patient, perceptive, and unrelenting. The night deepened, and with it, the mystery thickened. Somewhere in the village, beneath the gentle veneer of everyday life, the killer waited, watching perhaps, wondering if their carefully constructed facade would hold, or if Miss Marple's quiet brilliance would finally unmask them. The days that followed unfolded in a manner both slow and deliberate, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, was ever alert to the smallest shifts in atmosphere and conversation. She visited the local shops, attended the parish church service, and took quiet walks along the hedgerows, all while carefully observing the villagers' interactions. Beneath the veneer of normality, the undercurrents of suspicion and fear ran strong. Charles Barton, though still weakened, was growing steadier. He remained a vital source of information, yet even he seemed unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the secrets tied to the bracelet. Miss Marple found their conversations increasingly revealing, but also marked by a resigned caution. Charles spoke little of the past, as if reluctant to stir the very shadows he sought to escape. One afternoon, as the golden light of early autumn streamed through her sitting-room window, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Gresham arrived, his usual brash demeanor softened by evident tension. "Miss Marple," he began, "I believe we must speak frankly. There are things about the bracelet and my family's history that have been kept from me. I'm no longer sure whom to trust." She gestured for him to sit, her gaze calm and encouraging. "You are wise to seek clarity, Thomas. Secrets buried too long have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times." Thomas leaned forward. "My father has always been a guarded man. Since Evelyn's death, I've seen a change in him, a weariness. I fear there are truths he has withheld to protect us all." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "protection sometimes becomes imprisonment." He nodded slowly. "I want to know what you've uncovered." "What exactly is this pact Charles mentioned?" Miss Marple hesitated only briefly. "It is an old agreement dating back several generations involving certain families of this village. The bracelet is a symbol of that pact, a token passed down signifying allegiance and, perhaps, silence." Thomas frowned. "But why would such a thing lead to murder?" "Because some pacts demand more than loyalty. They demand sacrifice," she replied softly. "And when one breaks the terms, the consequences can be severe." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, arriving with a new report from the coroner. The body of Evelyn Barton had been examined once more, and a detail previously overlooked had come to light. The cause of death was not just a fall, Craddock explained. There were traces of a rare poison in her system, enough to incapacitate before she struck her head. A collective silence fell over the room. Thomas looked as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Miss Marple's mind raced. The poison suggested premeditation, an intent to ensure Evelyn's demise beyond a simple accident or misstep. The bracelet's significance grew heavier still. Over the next several days, Miss Marple turned her attention to the unknown stranger Margaret Hargreaves had mentioned. Through discreet inquiries at the local inn and the market, she learned the man was named Gerald Ashton, a historian specializing in local lore. He had come to the village ostensibly to research its ancient traditions, but his questions about the Barton family and the bracelet had unsettled many. One afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet Gerald at the village tea-room. The man was courteous, with sharp eyes that missed little. "You are quite interested in the bracelet," she observed mildly. Gerald smiled thinly. "It is a fascinating relic. But I must admit, I'm here because of rumors, stories whispered by old villagers. There is more to the Barton family than meets the eye." "And you believe uncovering these stories will benefit you?" Miss Marple asked. "Knowledge is always a benefit," Gerald said. "But perhaps there is more at stake than I realized." Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of a telegram for Gerald. He excused himself, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the intersection of his research with the unfolding tragedy. Meanwhile, tensions in the village escalated. Gossip and fear fueled a growing sense of unrest. At the market, whispered accusations flew like autumn leaves in a gust. Mrs. Hargreaves confided to Miss Marple her suspicions that someone was deliberately trying to destabilize the Barton family. Miss Marple, however, remained cautious. She understood that desperation could drive people to project their fears onto convenient scapegoats. Her own task was to sift through the noise, to find the still, clear thread of truth. One evening, as she sat by the fire reviewing her notes, a sudden thought struck her, something overlooked in the bracelet's intricate design. She recalled the fine engraving she had glimpsed briefly, a symbol that resembled a key intertwined with a serpent. This emblem was not just decorative, it was a cipher. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village library to consult the local history books, seeking any reference to such a symbol. To her surprise, she found an old journal tucked away in a dusty corner, written by a long-deceased member of the Barton family. The journal spoke of a secret room beneath the old Barton Manor, an underground chamber where the pact had been sealed and where the bracelet was originally forged. This revelation changed everything. The bracelet was more than a symbol. It was a literal key, pointing to a hidden location that might hold the final answers. Miss Marple knew what she must do next. She arranged to visit the Barton estate once more, this time with Charles and Thomas, hoping to unlock the secrets that had lain dormant for generations. As they descended into the cellar of the manor, a chill ran through the air. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not from fear, but from the thrill of discovery. In the dim light, she spotted a concealed door behind a stack of old crates. Charles, with trembling hands, used the bracelet to trace the shape of the key engraved on its surface against the door's lock. A soft click echoed in the silence when the door creaked open, revealing a small chamber lined with ancient parchments, faded paintings, and relics of a forgotten past. Among the artifacts lay a letter, yellowed with age, bearing the seal of the original pact makers. Miss Marple carefully unfolded it, reading aloud the solemn promises and warnings it contained. The letter spoke of loyalty, secrecy, and a curse upon those who betrayed the pact. The room held answers, but also questions. Who had feared the pact enough to kill? Who had the most to lose if the truth were revealed? As they emerged from the cellar, the weight of the mystery seemed heavier than ever. Miss Marple's eyes met those of Charles and Thomas, knowing the final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. Yet the true test of her subtle genius had only just begun. The discovery of the secret chamber beneath Barton Manor sent a ripple of unease through the village, though few outside the immediate circle understood the full weight of the revelation. Miss Marple, however, sensed that the puzzle was nearing its climax. She spent the next days piecing together the fragments of history and human nature with her usual quiet intensity. The ancient letter, sealed and preserved through the decades, spoke of a solemn pact sworn between prominent families of the village, an agreement to protect certain secrets at any cost, and a dire curse pronounced against any who would betray that trust. The bracelet, as Miss Marple now understood, was more than a token of loyalty. It was a key and a symbol of that sacred promise. It had been passed down through the Barton line, its significance perhaps too heavy for modern times, yet no less potent. Charles Barton's pale face betrayed his inner turmoil when Miss Marple shared her findings with him and Thomas. "So this is what Father was guarding," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Not just family secrets, but a burden, something that must never come to light." Thomas's jaw tightened. "And if someone broke the pact, killed Evelyn to keep the secret?" "It sounds like a dreadful curse indeed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The curse is more likely a warning, a tool to enforce silence. But human nature being what it is, fear can twist loyalty into something dark and dangerous." The inspector, who had joined them after hearing of the secret room, was less inclined to indulge in speculation, but acknowledged the importance of the find. "This changes the investigation. We must consider that the murder was not a crime of passion or greed, but one tied to this pact. It complicates motives, makes suspects more elusive." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the village thickened with suspicion. Miss Marple observed villagers exchanging wary glances, conversations dropping to hushed tones when she approached. Even the local shopkeepers seemed on edge, as if the discovery had cracked the surface of an old wound. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, turned her attention to the most unlikely suspect. Gerald Ashton, the historian whose curiosity about the village had coincided suspiciously with the tragedy. She arranged to meet him once again at the village tea room, where the chatter of neighbors barely concealed the tension in the air. "Mr. Ashton," she began, "you must understand the gravity of what you have stumbled upon. The pact is not mere folklore, but a binding agreement, and it seems your inquiries may have unsettled some deeply." Gerald's sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I seek only truth, Miss Marple. History should be revealed, not hidden away. But I admit the reaction here is stronger than I anticipated." "Curiosity can be dangerous," Miss Marple said gently, "especially when it touches upon lives still entangled in its threads." Gerald smiled thinly. "Perhaps. But if the truth means justice for Evelyn, then it is a risk worth taking." Miss Marple studied him quietly, noting the flicker of defensiveness beneath his polite exterior. "And yet, someone believed it necessary to silence Evelyn before she could reveal what she knew. Did your research threaten to expose that?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I was careful. At least I thought so." The conversation ended with a polite farewell, but Miss Marple's mind churned. She sensed that Gerald was more deeply involved than he admitted, whether by design or circumstance. As the days wore on, the police intensified their inquiries into the Barton family's connections. Miss Marple noticed how Charles became increasingly withdrawn, weighed down by family burdens and old guilt. One evening, as she visited to offer quiet companionship, he confided in her with a tremor of despair. "There are things Father never told me, secrets kept even from his own son. I fear the bracelet's meaning is darker than I imagined." "Evelyn." She was close to breaking the silence. Perhaps that was her true danger. Miss Marple nodded, offering her steady presence. Fear can drive even the gentlest to desperate acts, but the truth will out if we watch carefully. Her intuition led her back to the bracelet itself. She examined it again, noting the delicate craftsmanship and the intricate design that resembled entwined serpents and keys, a symbol repeated in the chamber's faded paintings. It was a symbol of duality, trust, and betrayal entwined. Then came the crucial moment that would test her subtle skill. Miss Marple invited the key players, the Barton family, Thomas, Margaret Hargreaves, and even Gerald Ashton, to a gathering at her home under the pretext of sharing her thoughts on the village's history and the bracelet's significance. The drawing room filled with polite conversation and careful glances, each guest keenly aware of the undercurrents beneath Miss Marple's gentle manner. She began, her voice soft yet firm. "We have uncovered much about the pact and the bracelet. But uncovering secrets is only the first step. Understanding human nature, the fears, the jealousies, the loyalties, is what will reveal the truth." Her eyes rested momentarily on each guest, watching their reactions. "There is a truth that some wish to bury with Evelyn Barton," she continued. "The bracelet is a symbol, but it also points to something tangible, a secret that must not see the light of day, or so someone believed." The room grew still. Miss Marple's gaze settled finally on Gerald Ashton. "Mr. Ashton, your arrival and interest were not mere coincidence. You sought truths, but some truths carry great risk." Gerald's face paled, but he maintained his composure. "I only sought to uncover the past." "Indeed," Miss Marple said quietly. "But did you realize that some in this room would do anything to protect that past? Even kill." A sharp intake of breath. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Miss Marple's gaze then shifted to Thomas Gresham. "And you, Thomas, inherited not only the bracelet, but the burden of silence. Were you prepared to keep it at all costs?" Thomas's eyes flashed with anger and fear. "I want no part of any murder or betrayal." "But the past has a hold on us all," Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The bracelet was worn by Evelyn the night she died. Its loss was meant to mislead, but the truth lies not just in the object, but in the actions it inspired. Her final test was subtle, a psychological game of observation and inference. She spoke calmly of loyalty and betrayal, watching each guest's posture, voice, and eyes. Small gestures, the tightening of a fist, a glance away, a sudden swallow, became clues. When she paused, letting silence settle, it was Thomas who faltered. His gaze dropped, a flash of guilt crossing his face. Miss Marple rose slowly. The murderer sought to protect a secret pact, to silence Evelyn before she could reveal the truth. But the bracelet's meaning was misunderstood. It was never meant to bind in fear, but to remind of trust and honor. Her eyes held Thomas's. "You broke that trust. You feared exposure. You poisoned Evelyn, hoping to end the threat. Yet in doing so, you doomed yourself to suspicion." Thomas's composure shattered. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I only wanted to protect the family, to keep the peace." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unwavering. "And that, dear Thomas, is where justice intervenes." The room remained silent as Thomas's confession filled the space. The villagers present, relieved yet saddened, realized the true cost of secrets kept too long. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple reflected on the fragile nature of human loyalty and the devastating consequences when fear eclipses trust. The bracelet, once a symbol of unity, had become an instrument of tragedy. Yet through patience, observation, and quiet determination, the truth had finally emerged from the shadows. The village would heal, though scars remained. And Miss Marple, ever composed, resumed her daily walks and tea gatherings, quietly aware that human nature would always offer new mysteries to unravel. The gathering at Miss Marple's cozy drawing room had drawn the village's key figures together one last time, each shadowed by the weight of suspicion and secrets. The air was thick with unspoken questions, but Miss Marple's serene presence steadied the room like a calm hearth in a storm. She sipped her tea thoughtfully before speaking, her voice soft, yet carrying the unmistakable authority of a mind that had quietly unraveled the tangled threads of the mystery. "Tonight, I will explain how all the pieces fit together," she began, her eyes meeting those of each person present, inviting them to listen closely but without alarm. The bracelet found in the coffin was indeed the linchpin, but not because of what it was. It was about what it represented and how it led us to the truth. She paused, letting the moment settle before continuing. Evelyn Barton was a woman burdened by the weight of family loyalty, but also by a fierce sense of justice. She discovered something that threatened to unravel the delicate balance maintained by a secret pact among several village families. An agreement formed long ago to protect reputations, yes, but at the cost of truth. Turning her gaze to Thomas Gresham, she spoke gently. "You inherited more than just a family heirloom. You inherited a duty, one that must be kept with utmost discretion. Yet, when Evelyn began to speak of revealing the pact, you feared the destruction it would bring. It was this fear, I believe, that pushed you to act with such finality." Thomas's face betrayed no surprise, only the weight of inevitable confession. "I did not want to kill her. I only wanted to silence the threat, to protect those I love." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically but firmly. "Fear is a powerful motivator, Mr. Gresham, but it can blind us to the cost of our actions. You administered the poison that ended Evelyn's life, hoping the bracelet's disappearance would mislead. But it was precisely the bracelet's symbolic significance that drew us here." She addressed the rest of the room. The bracelet was not just a token, it was a reminder of trust and honor. It was found in the coffin because Evelyn intended it to be a final testament, a silent message for those wise enough to understand. Only someone close to her would have known this and sought to hide the truth. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she concluded, "The village will remember Evelyn not for the tragedy that befell her, but for her courage in facing a legacy of silence. And as for us, may we learn that secrets kept out of fear serve only to deepen wounds." The room exhaled, the tension dissolving into a mix of sorrow and relief. Thomas, now resigned to the consequences, accepted the justice that awaited him, while others grappled quietly with the fragility of trust and the shadows cast by long-buried secrets. As the guests departed, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the last light fade over the village. The world remained the same, yet subtly altered. An ancient pact broken, a truth uncovered, and the enduring complexity of human nature laid bare. With a gentle smile, she turned back inside, ready for the next quiet mystery that life would surely bring.